Plato's concept of art and poetry. Though Homer, who was born in 8th century BC, and Aristophanes, who was born in the 5th century BC, had several passages of penetrating critical inquiry here and there in their works. It was only with Plato that criticism became a vital force in the ancient world. Plato was the first conscious literary critic who has put his ideas in a systematic way in his dialogues. Plato is recognized as a master of the dialogue form and as one of the greatest prose stylists of the Greek language. Plato was born in 427 BC. Plato was introduced to Socrates when he was a young boy. He first started writing poems but destroyed them under the influence of Socrates and developed interest in philosophy and mathematics. He founded his academy in 387 BC and taught his pupils philosophy, mathematics, natural science, jurisprudence, and practical legislations. He wrote his great books then, the Dialogues, Aeon, Symposium, and the Republic. He died in 347 BC. Though Plato's views on art and literature are scattered all over his Aeon and Republic, they are of at length and forceful. His views on poetic inspiration, imitation, and condemnation of poetry are also of great historical significance. Many of his utterances are of a challenging nature, and thus he gave a stimulus to literary criticism. His glowing fancy, his idealism, the subtle irony and humor of his style are beyond praise. Plato was an idealist. He believed that the phenomenal world, usual, known through senses, is but an objectification of the ideal world. The ideal world is real. The phenomenal world is but a shadow of this ideal reality. So it is fleeting and unreal. Plato describes poet as a light and winged and holy thing, and the poetic inspiration as something that happens in poet by power divine. God takes away the minds of poets and uses them as his ministers, as he also uses diviners and holy prophets. So we who hear the priceless words of the poets in a state of unconsciousness hear the words of God. As the poet speaks divine truth, poetry is not a craft which can be learned and practiced at will. This is the most elaborate presentation in the ancient world of the notion of poetry that survives even today with modifications. As Plato was an idealist, he believed that ideas alone are true and real. According to him, all the earthly things like beauty, goodness, and justice are mere types of copies of the ideal beauty, goodness, and justice which exists in heaven. He regards imitation as mere mimesis or representation of these ideal forms and not expression which is creative. The reality lies not in individual objects but in general ideas or forms. A painter only imitates what he sees. He does not know how to make or to use what he sees. He can paint a bed but can't make one. Similarly, the poets imitate reality without necessarily understanding it. Plato was a teacher and had his own academy. So his ideal was to turn out young men of well formed personalities, fit to be the leaders and rulers of an ideal state. His literary criticism is frankly utilitarian, more good to more people, that of educating the youth and forming them into good citizens of his ideal state. It is from this practical point of view that he judges poetry. So he had no any other way except attacking poets and poetry. Education was in a sorry state in Athens then. The epics of Homer formed an essential part of the school curriculum. They were venerated by the Greeks almost like the Bible. But in Homer, there are many stories which represent the gods in an unfavorable light. Allegorical interpretations of these stories were considered unconvincing and difficult to understand. Moreover, the wonderful flowering time of Greek art and literature was over, and the creative impulse had practically died away. So there was a degradation. As a result, philosophers and orators were regarded as superiors to poets and artists. So much of his criticism, thus in the nature, is governed by the social and political conditions of his age. Plato's published writings consist of some 26 dramatic dialogues on philosophical and related themes. In almost all the dialogues, Socrates is the main and Plato's mouthpiece. But Plato's Socrates is not the historical Socrates. Plato's dialogue does not always present a straightforward argument. The questions of Plato's Socrates towards his interlocutors, Adeimantus in Book 2 and Glaucon in Book 3 of the Republic, revolve around the role that literature should play in the education meant for the guardians, the future rulers. Thus, it becomes a discussion on the quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Actually, Ion examines poetry as a kind of divine madness, whereas in the Republic he argues for an ideal, well regulated community in which the educational curriculum should promote respect for law, reason, authority, self discipline, and piety. To him, literature should teach goodness and grace. Though Plato Socrates loves and regularly cites Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, he calls for the censorship of many passages in these works that represent sacrilegious, sentimental, unlawful, and irrational behavior. Actually, many of the stories of Greek gods were thought by Xenophanes, the pre-Socratic philosopher who was born in 570 BC and who died in 480 BC, to be possibly lies. So here he mentions the story of Uranus, who hated his children and kept them packed in their mother earth's womb, and how the mother earth made one of her children, Cronus, castrate, damaging testicles and make him impotent. His father and became the Lord of creation, and how later his son Zeus, with the help of his mother, overthrew Cronus and established himself as the king of all gods. Plato's Socrates also says that, similarly, the story of a horrific kidnap of Helen by Theseus and Perithous, who were respectively the sons of Poseidon and Zeus, is unbelievable and intolerable. Such stories fail to teach goodness and grace. He also insists that the gods are not shape shifting wizards and should not mislead the people by lying in what they say or do, as they are presented in many of the stories. According to Plato, as the epic, lyric, or tragedy, the literature that he has mentioned through Socrates are fictional and made up. They are dangerous, since they are too inferior to be accepted as a mimesis, a copy of a copy. He insists everyone should be aware of what in literature should be allowed and what should be censored. According to him, good literature, cultural studies, should lead the younger generation to love and be kind and to become ideal men and women. It must represent a world in which virtue rewarded and even the punishment of evil serves virtuous ends. Plato condemns poetry in Republic 10, Book 10, that they feed and water the passions instead of drying them up, and let them rule instead of ruling them. The poets, with their emotional frenzies and lack of moral restraint, can afford no safe moral and intellectual guidance. Thus, Plato attacks poetry on intellectual, emotional, utilitarian, and moral grounds and demonstrates its uselessness and its corrupting influences. He also condemns the ridiculous mixture of tragic and comic effects that were a feature of contemporary drama. He emphasizes for the first time that organic unity is essential for success in all arts. Plato ends his charges against poetry by saying that in an ideal state, no poetry should be admitted save hymns to the gods and panegyrics on famous men. According to him, the poets are to be honored, but they are to be banished from his ideal state.